we're very happy to have with us the Brink sisters. None of them are actually Brinks anymore at this point in their life, but they did all grow up on a historic 1880s cattle ranch near Miles City along the Yellowstone River. We have Anne Krickel of Phillipsburg, Montana. She's a musician and a former medical technologist. We have Jeanie Thiessen, who's from the Los Angeles area. She's a longtime elementary and special education teacher. And last but not least, we have Francie Berg from Henninger, North Dakota. She's a writer, a publisher, and a former teacher, and a county extension agent. And they're going to tell some stories, play some music, and share other insights from their new book, Montana Stirrups, Sage, and Shenanigans, Western Ranch Life in a Forgotten Era. And after the program, we're going to go to the lobby, and if anybody wants to buy a copy of the book, or if you brought one, our store has plenty of copies for sale, but they're going to have autographed books in the lobby. So we want to be sure and save time for that.
Thank you, Kirby. We want to present this book to the Montana Historical Society.
Thank you so much. For you. Great. I appreciate it. Welcome to our library. So thank you very much.
People often ask me what it was like growing up on a ranch in the Badlands of eastern Montana. Hollywood wants us to believe that it's the cowboy in his shiny, clean white hat with his jeans tucked into his boot tops, for heaven's sakes, dashing off into the horizon on a horse that never sweats. Actually, ranching in Montana is a good deal different than that. But first I want to tell you about my father. My dad was a typical grizzled Montana rancher, and he wanted sons. But what he got instead were daughters. However, he soon learned that anything sons could do, daughters could do better. So as soon as we learned to walk, he put us on a horse and set us out chasing cows. When we went to school, it was a one-room country school. Now, country schools can take grades 1 through 8, all in one room, one teacher. We never had that many. The most we ever had were 7 in the entire school. And then there was the year it was just myself and 2 others in the entire school. So, you know, we really didn't know how the rest of the world lived. We thought everyone our ages was out there herding cows. As we got older, Dad sent us out to summer pasture. Now, summer pasture was 50, 60 miles away. And we would go out there for 3 to 4 days out of a week, and usually every other week. At first, it was my 2 older sisters that did this. And then when they went off to school and college and jobs, then it fell to Francie and I. We were pretty young when we started doing this. Francie was 14, legal driving age in Montana at that time. I was 10. The reason they sent me along was that she had had a horse that she was breaking, slip on the ice, and the saddle horn went through a kidney. So the folks thought I should be with her. That lot of good I could have done at 10. We had a sheep wagon that Dad would pull out in the spring and back again in the fall. And that's what we lived in. We had no close neighbors because everyone lives far, far apart in that Badland country. We had no telephone, and cell phones weren't even a dream yet. We had no electricity, but worst of all, we had no running water. Now, in the first part of the year, it was really pretty nice, because then the springs were running. And the springs had this cool, crystal clear water. So we'd ride up to the spring, and we'd jump off our horses, and we'd get down and drink, with our horses beside us, slobbering into the water. Now, as summer wore on, with no rain in that badland country, the springs would tend to dry up, and then we had to drink from the reservoirs with the cattle. So we'd go to the upper end of the reservoir, where the freshest water would be, and we'd push the cattle down to the lower end. Then we'd go back up to the upper end, and we'd wait. We'd wait for the things to settle out where the cattle had been. And then we'd drink, and never tasted quite right. Mother was a school teacher when she married Dad, and she decided that her daughters would have culture. So culture took the form of classical piano lessons. And I took classical piano lessons many, many years, even though I soon really learned to dislike the piano. And my feelings for the classics were right behind. So when Mom wasn't within hearing distance, for Elise became this. Oh, start over. I promised some people I would have to start over partway through. I made it, didn't I? But life on the ranch wasn't all hard work and no play. We had lots of fun. There were the roundups and the brandings, and the neighbors would come from far and wide, and they'd bring their kids, and they'd stay all day, and then we got to go back and help them. And then there were the cattle drives, the roundups, and the cattle drives when we'd trail our cattle out to summer pasture and back. It took 3 or 4 days. Just my sister and I, and Dad would be there at night and in the morning to help us get off. But when I look back at the ranch, it's with love and longing. I think of the times at twilight time, trotting my horse down the trail after a hard day's work. Up on the ridge, the coyotes are howling, and down below, the deer and the antelope grazing. My home in the Badlands of eastern Montana. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. We want to tell you a few short excerpts from some of our stories in the new book. And some people ask why we picked our title, which is Montana, Stirrups, Sage, and Shenanigans. Well, it's pretty simple. Stirrups, because stirrups were pretty important in riding our horses. If we lost our stirrups, we were likely to land in a big, scratchy old sagebrush. Sage, because there's no more wonderful fragrance in the West that we know of than sage. And the smell of sage reminds me of riding out on a lovely spring morning, with much-loved saddle horse, hearing the meadowlark sing from the tallest pine tree, and a couple of deer jump out of the draw ahead and run up the side hill.
Because in our family, you looked for the humor. So even if you landed in the sage, smelling of sage for a while, the person riding along looked first to make sure you weren't hurt, or rattlesnake bit, or dropped into a hidden washout hole. We laughed just because it could be pretty funny, and we pulled some shenanigans along the way. So there you have it. Stirrups, sage, and shenanigans. That's what our book is about. And some other things.
This next story that we're going to take a couple of little excerpts from, it's from our chapter, Horses We Have Known and Loved Most of the Time. Francie, I believe you're starting this. I'm sorry.
We called Buck Mr. Personality. He was always there for a rub under his forelock, big brown eyes glowing warmly. He liked to tease and invent new tricks. One day he plucked Dad's straw hat off by the brim and held it high out of reach, nodding his head solemnly. Dad laughed with delight. "Hey, you give that back." Buck regarded him innocently. "Who, me?" he seemed to say. Dad had a pet hen that flew onto his shoulder when he went to the granary for feed, and would eat wheat out of his hand. Buck took great interest in that white hen, and it was pretty funny to see the three of them, all the horse and the hen maneuvering for Dad's attention. Snatching nibbles of grain, the hen scolded and pecked at Buck, never quite reaching him, but teetering and almost losing her balance.
Buck was the horse I was riding the day I made the worst decision of my life. When I rode across the long trestle at Deep Creek. We were trailing cattle that day. At 10 miles out, I was to return with Buck to the ranch. 10 miles over that rough country, the Badlands and the Cut Banks. No way. I decided to ride home on the Northern Pacific Railroad right-of-way. And I'd save miles. You know, the right-of-way, the trains followed the rivers. And everything was flat. Everything was fine until we came to the Deep Creek Railroad Bridge. So steep it was, only a trestle. There were no railings or anything on the side to hang on to. I couldn't get down the sides to cross Deep Creek. Couldn't cross the bottom anyway with its huge boulders and rocks on Buck. Back we went. We rode back about 3 miles, I think it probably was, and couldn't get open any of the rusted railroad gates. So we went back to the trestle, and that's where I made the decision to ride Buck across it. And Buck let me coax him onto the tracks. I'd say to Buck, "Lift your hoof, you're doing fine. That's good, Buck." And carefully he'd place each hoof over to the next tie, and then he'd bump the tie and then place his foot on it. He'd do this with each foot individually. Between the tie, there were the rocks way down below. I tried not to look. One slip of the hoof, and his thrashing legs would drop between the ties. A semaphore was at the end of the trestle, and then the railroad made a curve. So I thought, I'll watch that semaphore. If you know about semaphores, they were an arm, and they came down slowly when the train was on that track, on that part of the track. So I was scared, and we were going too slow. And it was taking me forever. I kept saying, "Keep going, Buck. Come on, good boy, let's just keep on going." And then I saw the arm of the semaphore coming down. At the same time, Buck felt the vibrations in the ties from the oncoming freight. His whole body trembled. And I just kept going and telling him, "Okay, Buck, we'll go, come on, it's okay." And he'd lean against me, and I'd feel him taking power from me, this great big quarter horse. Then suddenly, around the curve came the big black steam engine. It was right above us, and I yelled. And with only about 5 feet to go, I jumped, and Buck jumped too, and he jumped over me, and we rolled down the embankment. I jumped up And we always hang on to the reins. Yeah. And I ran over to a fence post and snubbed him up tight to get around the fence post, and I looked back at the engineer of the big locomotive as it sped down the track, and here's the engineer with his cap, waving and smiling.
Another much-loved horse was Flexi, a sorrel 2-year-old bought fresh from the range north of Miles City. Her life ended abruptly when, running in a storm one night, she stepped into a prairie dog pool. We had big prairie dog towns in several of our flats. Good old Eagle met the same fate and put his foot in a prairie dog pool, and of course had to be disposed of. But a marvelous event occurred when a bachelor neighbor who lived on part of our place gave us 3 horses. An old-timer, he liked to hang around the sale barns and keep in touch with the old days. These 3 horses are too good to go for killers, Bill said, unloading them in our corral. And he was right. They turned out to be wonderful horses, and one was a mare who kept having a colt every year. Up to that time, it seemed we never had enough horses, the right horse, for the job. All our horses had died of sleeping sickness the year before we came to the ranch near Miles City in 1939. We had some near escapes with our horses. Anne ended up with a brain concussion from her wild ride on Harold Cole's one-man horse that she mistakenly rode to bring in our horses. Or my 2-year-old I was breaking that slipped on the ice and went over backwards, the saddle horn splitting open my kidney. Often we were bucked off into cactus, rocks, and near rattlesnakes. There was always the chance of being bucked off with one foot hung up in the stirrup. We knew of riders dragged to death that way. It happened to Anne once, but she escaped in time. And there were wild horses, too, on the range there. We would glimpse them occasionally on the horizon, racing along a high ridge, their manes and tails flying. The black stallion stood guard until his harem disappeared from sight.
And now a few notes from a cattle trade story. Dad thought nothing of sending his teenage daughters out across country with a couple of maybe around 100 head of cattle or more, and riding at least one green broke horse. We were supposed to train this horse while we were riding cattle, and a vague map, if we were lucky. We leased some of the range through the years in all 4 directions, 50 or 60 miles from home. Probably farther, as we didn't travel straight, but found our route among meandering creek beds, over ridges, and across deep canyons. This took 4 days, and we were often lost. We mostly considered trailing a time of adventure, in which the unexpected often happened. When trailing spring and fall, we could have lovely weather, or any other type of weather. Often it was snow, rain, hail, always strong wind. I see a lady nodding. We could go to sleep on the ground by a bed of crocuses and awake in an April snowstorm. Or we could trail through hot, dry, dusty wind that never seemed to quit.
Trailing the first time out to Kemp's Range on the Mezpah Creek took Anne and me through many miles of Pine Hills country, with few gates and no trails or roads going our direction. Neither of us had ever ridden there before, and neither had Dad, but he confidently drew us a map on the back of an envelope. Fences and gates here and here, I think. Cross a few high ridges. There's a windmill about here, and down there is a reservoir where you can water the cattle at noon. Later on, you'll see 4 gate posts against the horizon. I'll meet you there with a load of hay, and we'll bed them down for the night. Anne and I took the map and turned our horses. It seemed like a long way without any solid landmarks. The cattle drive begins with an air of anticipation. The cattle feel excitement. They headed south on the old Yellowstone Trail for a while, and after some preliminary sparring, a lead cow established herself in the front and headed off down the trail. We had 3 or 4 good bossy cows, Roni, Crumplehorn, and Old Yellow, who just naturally wanted to lead. Anne and I rode up and down the sides to keep them moving. This was our favorite system, stringing out the herd behind a good lead cow, rather than bunching them up and chasing from the back like some folks did. As we reached the Pine Hills, the country grew more and more rugged. We puzzled over our map. What do you think? Where's the windmill? There's a long ridge up here. Is that on the map? I don't think so. And where are the fences, the gates? Maybe they're just not on this map. Yeah, maybe not. We had to laugh knowing the shortcomings of our maps. At least this time, we had a map on a real piece of paper. Sometimes Dad drew them in the dirt with a stick. Couldn't take that along. We rode all day without seeing a map. A ranch. Often we didn't know where we were going, but just the general direction. It's an uneasy feeling choosing one ridge over another one, each with their secondary draws and ridges, which could take us miles out of the way if we were on the wrong one. No cell phones to get advice, no car to run for help, just us and the cows, and we could not leave them.
We met many different challenges when trailing cattle. Sometimes a big silver span bridge stood in our way to spook the horses and the cows, crossing the Yellowstone River, pretty wide down there, and Powder Rivers. There were old broken down fences, and cows crossed freely back and forth, but our horses couldn't. Once a small calf ran wildly down the fence line, and we had to cut out his mom and chase her back a half mile to get the calf. Another time, as we trailed between the railroad and highway, we noticed an unfenced field of ripe wheat. Our cows ignored it until suddenly a train came by and blew his whistle. In seconds, our entire herd stood knee-deep in golden grain. From a distant farmhouse, a man shook his fist and shouted at us. We finally got him out of there, and we didn't look back.
And then there were our inadequate maps. That day in the Pine Hills, it turned out that the fences and gates were wrong. We never did see the windmill or the reservoir. We watered instead in a spring-fed creek. That afternoon, it grew late with still more ridges and hills rising ahead. No roads in sight. The lead cows heard it first and lifted their heads. Caboose! Caboose! They picked up their pace and moved softly. We crested the rise, and there was our truck by the 4 gateposts. Dad was spreading hay and calling, Caboose! Caboose! They ran to the alfalfa hay, and soon they were tossing it in the air and eating their fill.
Sometimes people left horses at our ranch for a few months, always encouraging us to ride them. We girls regarded that as a favor. We liked trying out a new horse. But actually, of course, the owners wanted their horses tamed down or kept gentle or free. One time, it was a pair of white circus horses. They were slightly injured in a wreck. And after they got a little bit better, the veterinarian called Daddy and asked him to pasture them and persuade his daughters to ride them. through one whole summer and fall. We never knew what those circus horses would do. And we could only ride one at a time because those horses danced. They danced all day. And one person could not ride a dancing horse the whole day, so we had to change off. One day, up on the range, I rode over a hill, and below us were these wild cattle of Greaves. They all turned facing me, with their startled white faces and their red ears sticking out straight. Their eyes were big and round, and you could see the blood vessels behind them. Typically, our cow, maybe a steer or a heifer, would get in with that bunch. Daddy didn't want him in with those cattle, especially his heifers. So, all you did was raise your hand, send off the herd of Greaves cattle, and our animal, we'd take it home. Well, I raised my hand to send them off, to say, "Get out of here!" And suddenly, while they watched, my little white circus pony stopped and bowed slowly and when he bowed, he tucked his head between his knees, went clear down so his knees were on the ground, and his head disappeared beneath him. And I was back in the saddle like this, and all the Greaves cattle were watching me. His bow was deep, slow, and profound, and then he stood respectfully at attention. Greaves' wild cattle were so astounded, they just stared instead of stampeding in the other direction. And I almost went, "Get!" and I grabbed my hand back. 30 of those cattle, all with identical expressions of astonishment.
This next little excerpt is from Francie's first hunt. And I talked with some of you ahead of time here, and I know that many ranchers and farmers and women, and I suspect you all hunted, so you'll know what I'm talking about when I read this story. I got to go with Francie when she shot her first deer. She was 12 and I was 8. One shot, and she killed her first deer. I was so proud. Deftly, she reached down and cut his throat, quickly as Dad had told her, to bleed him out. Then, staring at me across the dead buck, Francie said, "Do you know how to do this?" I gave a firm shake of my head. "But I've seen Dad do it. I think you start up here." I pointed to the top of his brisket and pointed clear down to his tail. Francie looked dubious. Then her face lit up. "You do it." Francie said those dreaded words as she thrust the knife at me. "Please, no," I hesitated briefly. "But if I say no, will I ever get to go hunting with her again?" Not wanting to chance missing the next adventure, I grabbed the knife. Holding it perpendicular to the deer's chest, I thrust it hilt deep into his innards and sawed all the way down to his tail, as deeply as I could. The sliced open stomach spewed out half-digested alfalfa. Blood gushed, and the mess from the sliced intestines overwhelmed us as it oozed out all over me. An unpleasant odor filled the air. Francie and I both gagged a couple of times, and I momentarily wondered about all this oozing stuff and why it smelled so much more than when Dad did. Undaunted, I continued. I sliced around the insides of the deer, trying my hardest to free his insides, which were now slimy, unmanageable goo. It all had to come out. I pulled and pulled. Then a few things snapped, hit me in the face, and the insides came tumbling out. Oh, Francie had been gagging over on the sidelines, and she decided it was time to go get Dad and get him to bring the tractor down in the field so that he could take the deer and up in the barn and wash it out. She was mostly clean. She said I should stay with the deer, in case a coyote came along to steal our venison. Much later, I realized she didn't want to smell me all the way back. On further reflection, this was probably for the best. If Dad or Mom had seen my bloody, manure-covered self without first knowing this was all deer blood, it might have been a shock. Dad and Francie arrived on the tractor. Since he saw her first all nice and clean, he naturally supposed she had done a neat job of cleaning out the deer. Then he saw me cough and tried not to laugh as he turned his head, so I couldn't see.
We want to tell you about our ranch, the Brink Ranch, a good place for cattle. From the first cattlemen that came into our valley, this was 10 miles east of Miles City on the Yellowstone River. The place that became the Brink Ranch was recognized as a prime location for ranching. An early owner of our ranch, Henry Tussler, once ran thousands of cattle on both sides of the Yellowstone River. We were only 10 miles from Miles City, and the ranch provided a ready supply of beef for the military base at Fort Keogh, which was established in 1876, just after the Custer Battle at the Little Bighorn. We were the last place in the irrigated valley, right where the high bluffs circle around against the river. 5 important roads and trails cut across our place, and still do, each of them seeking the easiest and fastest route onto the high plateau from the fertile irrigated valley below.
You can see the 5 roads on this map. The old Fort Keogh Trail, Buford Trail, the 1912 Yellowstone Trail, it was finished in 1913, the yellow, and then the railroad tracks, and the Yellowstone River, which of course saw Clark of Lewis and Clark expedition. The high buttes above here, so you see they couldn't get down close to the river, so they came through our place. So we had 5 big trails going through there. And then it went up past the face, which was carved into a sandstone cliff. They connected Fort Keogh with 2 other military forts on the Missouri River, Fort Buford at the mouth of the Yellowstone, and Fort Lincoln at Bismarck. It was built by local people. In true pioneer style, the ranchers came with their drags and their tractors and their horses, and they cut it through their own property and helped their neighbors.
Remnants of those early roads can still be seen on our ranch. They cut through more than a mile swath through our land, as did the U.S. Highway number 10, New Highway number 10, and Interstate 94, built through on the south side of our buildings. In addition, 2 railroads ran along the Yellowstone River beside our land, and even in the 1880s, daily brought trainloads of people and supplies into our valley. And of course, lots of traffic and steamboats on the river in those days. Thus our hills saw extended travel across the centuries, and still do.
So if you came from Terry to Miles City or Yellowstone Park, you went through our land. Made our mother pretty exasperated to have all that right away come out of our pastures. We moved to the ranch 10 miles east of Miles City in the spring of 1939, just as the green grass was beginning to show through the snow. How wonderful this green valley looked to Mom and Dad, who had recently moved there from the dry land and the drought and depression of the Missouri River breaks. We came with almost nothing. As I mentioned, our horses had all died the year before of sleeping sickness. Our cattle were long gone due to the drought. There was no grass that grew. They were replaced by 300 head of sheep. But that year, the ewes caught a disease called vibrionic abortion, and they lost all their lambs, aborted their lambs. So we lost all the use on the mortgage. This new ranch was to be ours for the next 33 years. And as kids, we wasted no time in deciding which of the big bedrooms would be ours. 10 rooms in that big house. We could get lost in that house with its 2 stairways. And we had plenty of races up and down and through the house. Sometimes in the middle of a fight. For the first time, we had running water. It was piped from a free-flowing spring up on the hill. And we had a real bathroom. In 1939, this was one of the few ranch houses with running water. I remember Mom explaining to us that we had to use real toilet paper because catalog pages would plug up the plumber. I was only 6, but I remember being quite alarmed by the extravagance of buying paper for this purpose.
This next one is a shenanigan. And guess who was the shenanigan leader in our group? Riding down off the Rim Rocks that day, Jeannie's eyes narrowed as she studied the controversial hotel billboard. What do you think we could do with that? She wondered, with that certain gleam in her eye.
Anne and I knew instantly what she meant. Words can be changed to give an unintended meaning. The imposing Miles Howard Hotel billboard, standing on a big curve of our pasture by the highway, nagged like a festering sore in our family. As cars swept around the last hill coming down into the valley, it told everyone of the newest and largest hotel in Miles City. Some of you maybe remember this hotel. Mom and Dad didn't want signs littering up their pasture, but money was tough in those days, and the $200 annual lease that was promised would ease their hardship a little.
But the only problem was they never paid us.
Right, years passed. Simplicity itself, the billboard gave a powerful message, even as it defaced the natural sagebrush bluff where it stood. Miles Howard Hotel, it's spelled out in big wooden nailed-on letters. To the right, a brilliant red circle, 4 feet in diameter, said room rates. And what do you think the room rates were? For the grandest hotel in Miles City, $2.50 to $3.50 a night. The hotel was a great success. The billboard was undoubtedly effective. Then Jeannie began laughing.
Look, if we pried off the last letters of Howard Hotel, it would read, how hot. And my goodness, it's hot today.
or even my how hot, I put in, with 2 exclamation points. And paint the circle like a big red sun with radiating heat waves coming out.
My how hot, I said. It's perfect. Simplicity itself.
A few weeks later, we were goaded into doing exactly that. We don't have time to tell you the outcome tonight, just that it turned out to be one of the most successful pranks ever.
And we got the entire amount paid through all those years.
Sorry I didn't introduce our props man.
Oh, no, that's okay. You did at the beginning.
Okay, thanks.
In December,
Give the title.
the
Give the title.
oh yes, These are samples from World War II. How many of you remember World War II? A lot of us. In December 1941, we entered World War II. The war was no distant drumbeat. It was here, and it included us. Heavy army trucks roared into the ranch yard, loaded with captured Nazi soldiers standing in the back. It felt like our ranch was being invaded. These were Rommel's crack troops, Hitler's master race, captured in North Africa and come to harvest our beets. Even the American guards with their khaki uniforms, rifles, and bayonets looked dangerous to us. We raised sugar beets for the war effort. Sugar, a main ingredient in explosives, was desperately needed. Sugar beets required a lot of handiwork. Since all available beet workers were drafted, the government brought us prisoners the Allies captured in North Africa. Soon, over 100 Nazi prisoners, with 6 or 8 armed guards, swarmed over our fields. But even as prisoners, these strong, vigorous German men planned to win the war, and everyone knew it. They looked around for ranches to own and claim for themselves. And that was really scary, because it was obvious they liked our ranch, and the war was not going well for us.
We saw the urgency of war every day in the long freight trains that rumbled past on the 2 railroad tracks, with their ominous shipments of khaki camouflage jeeps, tanks, and anti-aircraft guns. Troop trains, too, roared by, silhouetting in every window a soldier wearing a military cap in uniform. By 1944, the tide of the war had changed. The POWs in our fields were old men and young boys. One man was 84, and a young boy 12. A community responsibility all through the war was guarding our end of the Milwaukee Railroad Bridge by our lower pasture from sabotage. Across the Yellowstone River on the other side, the Kinsey farmers and ranchers guarded their end of the bridge. This was kept kind of secret, and we weren't supposed to talk about it. But I'm sure that all up and down the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers, there were local people volunteering to guard those bridges from sabotage. We helped Dad scrounge the hills and deserted homesteads for scrap iron, much of it along the old Yellowstone Trail. It was melted down and used to build tanks and guns. It was one more task for the war effort, a way that we helped on the home front when our young men went off to war as soon as they got to be 18. And powerful Nazi and Japanese forces overran Europe and Asia.
We were just kids, but everyone in our country school had a deep sense of responsibility and patriotism to help win the war. At Christmas, we walked to our neighbors to sell Red Cross stamps for a penny each. We saved our own money to buy war bonds at $18.75 that matured in 10 years. America didn't borrow money from China to fight that war, but from its own people, from all of us.
We need to tell you about the sheep herder holdup we had. After herding our feeder lambs in a field near the highway, our Bulgarian neighbor, Teddy Wasso, got a jolt that he dreaded for a lifetime. He was grazing the lambs on leftover crops after harvest, a one-week job before they went into the corrals for feeder lambs for the winter. When the hired man came to take his place and corral the sheep for the night, Teddy got in his car that was parked by the highway and started off for his home. As he told the story later,
suddenly I hears this loud breathing behind me. and a hand seizes my shoulder. This is it, I think. All my life, I know this is going to happen. Someday I'm going to get mugged, robbed, maybe stabbed or shot. Now here it is. His heart racing, Teddy pulled over to the side of the road and stopped the car. He sat there. Why didn't I look in the back before I got in the car? I tried to think how to defend myself, but I was frozen. I couldn't move. But nothing happened. The hand stays there on my shoulder. I was so scared I couldn't turn to look back. Okay, I says, what you want? The hand pressed his shoulder. The silence broken only by heavy breathing in his ears. I got no money. I take you where you want to go. But the guy behind me, he don't say nothing. Just keeps breathing loud with his hand on my shoulder. I sits there, my heart beating like crazy. Then I feel something wet slap against my ear. Finally, I gets up my nerve and turns around. There's your dog, Jimmy. He's standing up in the back, on his back legs, panting. His paw heavy on my shoulder, licking my face and smiling at me. And as he turned to leave, he paused in the doorway and said, I love that dog.
A little about our book. A few days after 9/11, 2001, as we were traveling through Miles City, we had a tent in the car, as we often did, and we decided that we would camp on those bluffs overlooking the Yellowstone River. The next morning, as we hiked that ridge, we would see a trail, a rock, or a tree, and we would think of things that happened there, and the memories flowed. And we started talking, and of course we started laughing about the things that happened. And we would point to one another, saying, you should write that down. But we didn't.
But we didn't. After our oldest sister... We were so pleased. Sorry, I changed this at the last minute. We're so pleased that this book is getting good reviews, and that people tell us it's my turn. Sorry about that.
Another hysterical turn of the page.
Sorry about that.
Lots of fun on our
We have a face page, by the way. So if you go on face page and type in Montana Stirrups, you can see the jokes that Diane has not let us forget.
Oh, that's so funny.
Okay. Not on the face page. Okay, so they told us we should write. We told everybody they should write the story down, but not ourselves. After our oldest sister Beverly died a couple years later, in 2003, we realized we three sisters were the only one left who knew our adventures, our hard work, and joy while we lived here. If we didn't get these facts down on paper, they would be lost to our kids and grandkids and generations to come. So we started writing them. And as we shared these writings with our kids, their response surprised us. You've got to make this available to other people, they said. This is real ranching history. And they urged us to put it in book form. So here it is. 408 pages, over 260 historic family pictures, lots of little designs that Anne drew, and cutouts and pullouts and so on. The book has over 90 chapters, but the stories are short, so it can be read a little at a time. It's easy reading, and picked up again later.
And people tell us that it's a fun and interesting book to read. We want people to understand what ranching life was like at that time. in the era before, during, and after World War II, before ATVs replaced horses, as it's done in some ranches. What life was like before cell phones, TV, the internet, and for most of us ranchers, no telephones or electricity, because copper was not available until quite a while after World War II was over.
We hope that our book will inspire you. In talking with you as before we started this program, you each had interesting, unique stories, and we hope you will write them down. How many of us wish that when our grandparents or our ancestors came over from the old country, that they had written down things about what they did when they first got here, instead of, no, we just have, or most of us just have their date of birth and where they died and their age. So I encourage you to write these down. And, you know, it needs to be now. You need to do it now. Because we waited for the old-timers to write it down. And then we realized that we were the old-timers. Now.
We thank you for coming. And we want you to have a good afternoon.
Whatever.